what I was veering into at that point was state formation.
Mm-hmm.
State formation, I have to credit someone I don't or didn't agree with very much for drawing me into the discussion. I was at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, and so was Gabriel Almond, a leading political scientist of his time at Stanford. Gay Almond was a member of the Committee on Political Development of the Social Science Research Council, a very influential organization in its time. Published a series of books on political development in the model of economic development, with the notion that there were standard sequences, and even, for some at least, the idea that you could draw prescriptions and predictions of future development for countries like Burma or China from a proper reading of the history of Western countries. Now, I mean, this is not such a wild idea. W. Rostow, after all, had extrapolated from British experience and then more generally from Western experience into a model of economic growth through capital accumulation. But it was a kind of direct borrowing from this. And members of the Committee on Political Development had come to a realization that they were relying very heavily on incomplete knowledge of European experience. That is, they were reasoning from the history of Germany or France or of Great Britain in schematic terms, but they were assuming such things as the proposition that the stages of political development, consolidation of this, creation of central authority, and so on, had occurred more gradually and smoothly in Western Europe than they could possibly occur today in Brazil or Burma or elsewhere in the world. And that part of the problem of turbulence in the Third World was accelerated political development and so forth. So some members of the Committee on Political Development thought, we better look at this story we're telling and verify that the European countries did go through these sequential developments. Well, there's a lot to what they did at that time, but the part that affected me most directly was that Gay Almond came to me and he said, Chuck, we'd like you to put together a group of historians, the historians of your choice, to look at Western European experience in the light of this. And implicitly, the invitation was verify our theory of sequences. Well, it was a wonderful opportunity. I mean, my one failure in recruiting the dream team that I wanted was that George Roudet, as a card-carrying communist, couldn't get a visa. I was very disappointed by that, and he was angry at me. I mean, not for raising the question, but for not being able to follow through. I mean, I became part of the American conspiracy in some sense. I felt very badly about that when I interviewed him in London and had to explain. Well, I mean, he knew that his visa had been refused. But in some sense, I as an American was responsible. So I didn't get Roudet, but I got a bunch of other very interesting people to come to Stanford for summer. already with papers on different aspects of political change. Now, I was suspicious of the Committee on Political Development from the beginning. I wouldn't have taken the assignment if I hadn't thought there were very serious difficulties in this idea of a standard scheme, the gradualism, etc. But in any case, I recruited a group of people to talk about largely extractive and controlling aspects of state formation in Western Europe over basically the 17th, 19th centuries. So we got Rudolf Braun, Gabriel Artin, a number of other people who did very fine first essays. We got together for a summer and had a great time. Sammy Feiner was one of the group, and argued about each other's essays, went from one to another, spent a week on each one, and rewrote and circulated and so forth, then went back to our various places of work and rewrote, and then a couple of years later met in Bellagio to spend a week talking about what we thought were the final papers, doing some further revisions, and finally in 1975, which is 6 years after our gathering in Stanford, came out with a volume called The Formation of National States in Western Europe. I wrote 3 chapters of the 9 chapters, one of them being the chapter I had hoped Roudet would write, which was Food Supply and Public Order in Western Europe, and so forth. And I learned a great deal from doing that work. I got a much clearer idea of struggles over food that served me well. As a matter of fact, served Chinese historian Bin Wang well, because he then picked up some of these questions and asked about the Chinese equivalent.
Right, the famine relief system.
That's right, that's right. So, I mean, I won't take credit for Bin Wang's career, but in a sense, the undergraduate thesis he did for me on so-called food riots in Western Europe at Michigan was the beginning of his interest in this general topic. So forth. All right, so we come out with this book, which certainly does not confirm the Committee on Political Development. In fact, to my satisfaction, shows what a struggle-filled process the emergence of national consolidated states was in Western Europe, all the contingency that we talked about earlier. But I made a mistake, and that is in the title of the book and in the polemical essays that form part of the introduction and conclusion that I wrote, I deliberately adopted the term state formation. Now, why did I do that? Because I wanted to stress the alternative to the idea of political development. I thought, and I persuaded my colleagues, that this was a neutral term. Well, it was a mistake. Almost immediately, people started using the term state formation teleologically. So the question is this state formed yet? And so you got numerous essays on the failure of state formation in fill in the blank or something like that. And I thought, oh, another mistake, and so forth. All right, I mean, what I wanted to illustrate, there's lots more that happens. You know, I now talk about state transformation. There is no neutral term because people have teleological agendas whenever they think about the history of states. But that was one of the more serious ones precisely because it was so successful. That is, it was a term that people were waiting for, but they were waiting for it in a version that I did not intend, and couldn't conceivably control once it came out. My protestations, no, this is not a teleological conception. This is the notion is not that you fulfill the requirements and you become a PhD or something like that. That's not the notion that we had in mind, but the damage was already done. Now, I mean, I've done other concepts of that kind that turned out to have ticking bombs in them, but I think that probably is the one that did the most damage of all those.